Is that on? Yep. Okay, welcome back, everybody. I hope you're well fed and watered. And thank you very much for networking, for going and seeing the exhibitors. We're going to start this afternoon's session. We've got two speakers. So individually, we will hear from them, and then we'll be able to do a Q&A following James Brown's presentation, and James is up next. So James Brown is from Polybell Farm on cultivating change and rethinking farmed peatlands. There's so many exciting initiatives being driven by James and his team to navigate through the challenges. He's going to require out-of-the-box thinking. So we may need a combination, of behavioural change, operational change, and financial change. And I'm really pleased that we're able to hear from James today. Thank you, James.
Good afternoon, everyone. So just to run through what I'm going to talk about, and my main focus is to share with you my experience of the farm and what we've been doing up at Polybell on the Lapwing estate. We've actually got two current tracks running. The first one is around our agri-tech business, which we founded, which is all about how can we get those marginal gains. And then the second piece of work is a rather more extreme project, which looks at land use change. So a quick introduction to me. I'm the fifth generation to be involved in the Lapwing estate, and over the time, the business has changed very dramatically. So a whole combination of different work, including agricultural merchanting, farming, food processing, now into organic farming in particular. So I joined the business in 2007, having done accountancy in London and a degree in economics and politics and international relations, so no farming training whatsoever. And if I just give you a little bit of an introduction to Polybell, so we're a 5,000 acre organic farm. We're in the Humber Head levels. So we go from -1 metre below sea level to +1 metre above sea level. And, as I mentioned, we're now all organic. And some of the real highlights from a biodiversity point of view, we've got 186 different species of bird recorded on the farm. 3 pairs of breeding turtle doves, so one of the most northern sites for that, and one of the highest density of lapwing in the UK. And alongside that, though, and absolutely core, is we produce approximately the equivalent of about 10 million Sunday lunches. So we have lamb and dairy on the farm, we have arable crops, and then the core of the business is veg, which we both grow and pack on farm. So I'm sure everyone is familiar with the challenges. As a larger scale farmer, we've seen over half the single farm payment disappear, basic payment scheme. That's obviously produced a challenge, and we've had to reorganize the business and make some very significant changes to deal with that economic impact. The weather risk, we've gone from 40 degrees 2 summers ago to we had several hundred acres of land underwater in the last few months. And actually how you plan the management of that business and producing crops week in, week out for a retailer with those extremes is a real challenge. So I think the key here is resilience. What I'm going to talk to you about isn't a blueprint to do on any other farm, but is purely, hopefully, to demonstrate the thought process that we've been through. So just imagine if every seed you planted last year had been sold as a crop. And just imagine what that would have done to your profitability. Now imagine that all the nitrogen that you applied to your farm had either gone into that sold item or was available for next year. Imagine that all the herbicide you applied actually hit a weed. So how much of that input did not really create an output? And when you change your thought process from thinking about yield, from simply the tons per hectare that you produce, to the percentage of input that produces an output. Now, this is my boring accountancy training, but coming in. But actually what it means is you start to think very differently. And what we really want to do is to start to think about farming on the individual plant level. So, and for me, this is really the challenge. How do you produce a sustainable food and make a sustainable profit and enhance the environment? And to me, all three of those have to happen together in order for us to have a long-term business. So, what I want to tell you, though, is you can have your cake and eat it. And that the whole future profitable farming businesses, the most profitable will also be the most environmentally sustainable, because they will use the inputs in the most sustainable and produce the most outputs from it. So, we've got, as I mentioned, two parallel tracks. The first one, which I want to talk to you about, is our ag tech business, which we've set up. So, this is a business I founded 6 years ago now, Earth Rover, and it originally came, the reason Earth Rover is we licensed the first bit of tech from the ExoMars rover project. Lesson number one there isn't water and mud on Mars. So a lot of redesigning had to go into that. So what this is all about, though, is this: how do I take farming down to the individual plant-based level? And because that is where the real gains, both for profitability, but also reducing my carbon footprint and making more land available for other use. So every year, 30 billion is spent on herbicides globally, putting 1 million tons of product into the environment. For me, that isn't sustainable. And the challenge as an organic farmer, weed control is a real challenge. We end up with people literally on hands and knees in vegetable crops, pulling weeds out. And the cost there can be up to sort of £3,000 a hectare. So for us, finding a solution, and at the time, there weren't solutions out there. So the best idea, set up a solution and deliver it yourself. So really three ways. There's a chemical way of killing weeds, mechanical. The problem with the mechanical solution is it disturbs the soil and it burns a lot of diesel. So back in 2011, we did a project with the Soil Association on low carbon farming, where we did one of the very early carbon toolkits. And we looked at all the different things. And first of all, we implemented renewable energy. So that solved our electricity problem, redid the cold stores. But the real big thing that jumped out at us as an organic farm is tillage of the land was a huge part of our carbon footprint. The diesel involved, as well as that disturbance of soil. So what we've come up with is a product called Claws. So it's concentrated light, autonomous weeding and scouting. And the idea here is that we target the meristem, the growing point of the weeds, with light. So what is concentrated light? Imagine you're back at school, and imagine you've got a magnifying glass and a piece of paper. That's basically what we're doing. We're concentrating LED light onto a very small focal point, about 1 millimeter, the growing point, and we're superheating that, so the cells boil and burst, and that then kills the weed. So the idea here is it's a non-chemical solution, and also, as you can see there, it's powered by solar, so it's solar and battery. And hopefully you will see a short video. This is from Spain, where I've just got back from, where we've got, obviously we test in the winter there. This is on a lettuce crop, and we're able to weed now up to 60 weeds per second with this. And what we've done is we've started on those veg and salad crops. We're now looking as well at both tree seedlings, sugar beet as well, some broadacre crops. So we've got pioneers out in both UK and Europe for this summer, and then hope to continue growing that. But what's more, not only do we weed the crop, we also gather individual plant data. So every single plant is given its own individual ID, and we watch how it grows. Now, we're not quite at the point yet to give each one of those its own recipe, but that is the long-term aim. And the idea here is to give you the data to reduce those inputs. You reduce the inputs, as you heard from Liz earlier, that has a huge impact on reducing your carbon footprint. So that's hopefully given you a quick insight into the ag tech side of what we are doing and how we can continue farming, reducing our footprint. But we've also got another project, and this is called Reverse Coal. So back in, I mentioned 2011, we did the carbon footprint, and by 2020 we had halved from a tonne a hectare down to half a tonne a hectare our operational emissions. I then met with a Professor Chris Evans from UKCH who said, James, that's wonderful. You do realise your peat is emitting 35 tonnes of CO2 per hectare. And he said, if it's deep peat, and it might be 15 to 20 if it's not so deep peat. And that is why now UK peatland, lowland peat, is 3% of the total carbon emissions. Bear in mind, agriculture as a whole is 11%. So the land use of peatland, but the problem is it's our most fertile farmland we have. You know, it's where over a third of all fresh veg and salad crops are grown. And if we were to simply re-wet them, that food would be either grown on land which would require significantly more inputs, or alternatively it'd be imported from exactly the same land from which we've stopped producing here. So the key to reducing the emissions is to raise the water table. And as I say, you raise the water table, you can't produce food. So that's the real challenge which we've been trying to address. So we've come up with reverse coal. Now, reverse coal re-wets the peatland, which stops the emission, and we now grow wetland trees on there. So our farm is what we also call carland, so C-A-R-R, which is Old English for wet woodland. And our idea is we will now grow wetland biomass on there. We harvest that on a 3-yearly cycle, so that's taking carbon out of the atmosphere into the trees. We then process that through a process called pyrolysis, which is the heating of the material in the absence of oxygen. So think making charcoal. And we then take the solid carbon that comes from that and we bury it back underground. Now, hence the term reverse coal mining. What we've done and the MRV, so monitoring, reporting and verification, we're able to demonstrate that we will lock that carbon up for greater than 1,000 years. So again, Liz mentioned the idea of permanence in her talk. This is absolutely critical. So the work we're doing with the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero is exactly this. They would argue that soil carbon is not a permanent store. However, what we are looking here at is actually long-term stored carbon. Now, as I mentioned, we've changed the land use. So what we then do is we use the energy from this process, the electricity and heat, to grow under controlled environment agriculture the food which we've lost. Now, it'll be a different set of food, but this will then enable us to actually increase the UK self-sufficiency in those core veg and salad crops, which are at the moment only running at around 50% self-sufficiency. So hopefully it's a short video to explain the process. So the whole idea of this project is to look at a whole range of different both ecosystem services as well as the food production. So we've got obviously part of the net zero strategy, the re-wetting of peat. The current government targets are 30,000 hectares to be re-wet by 2030 and 280,000 by 2050, according to the Climate Change Committee. What's really interesting is if we grow a crop which can sit underwater, we can allow that area to flood to protect towns and villages. We know that both willow and reed are really good at purifying water. Both the rivers that flow through the estate are failing from a water framework directive. Moving from a farmed system to a polluter system, we believe will enhance biodiversity, but absolutely critically, it also generates the jobs. So up into this Humber region is the area of the UK which has the most number of jobs in high carbon industries. So it will be the biggest, most affected as we decarbonise the economy. So being able to create significant jobs in this area we see as absolutely critical, as well as generating additional food security and enhancing the productivity of food. So for us, yes, there are incredibly tough times. It has been a real challenge rebasing the business following the changes to the support systems, the weather conditions which we're facing. They are no longer once-in-a-generation weather events. But I'm incredibly optimistic about what can be done. So just a quick thank you to the various people who've supported. So in total, we've gone about 12 million of R&D into these various projects on the estate with support from UKRI and in particular the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. So thank you very much.
Huge thank you to James for your time there. And I think it's fair to say that whilst those opportunities are not applicable to everybody, what is to be shown is the innovation that can come from that thinking, that working together, and what can actually be achieved on our own farms and businesses. So do we have any questions? We've got time for a couple of questions for James, but whilst you're all thinking, because I know there'll be loads burning there, and Charles and Rob is here with your microphones, I'll just ask a quick one if I can, James. Like we just said, these options potentially aren't open to everybody. But where did you start in terms of thinking about utilising robotics or the reverse coal? You know, what was it that actually prompted those decisions and those ideas?
No, thank you. All of the things which I'm looking at here have come out of the problems on the farm. So robotics, how do I weed without using chemicals because I'm organic? And without tilling the soil. With regards to the land use, I was faced with a really difficult dilemma. This fact that government have announced their policy that they wish to re-wet the type of land I'm farming with. And what I could do is simply take it out of production, look towards a peatland code solution restoration. But when you do that, you lose all the economic activity from that land. And for me, we're running a business. And that's where we then started thinking, okay, what can I do which achieves the objectives of what the scientists are telling us are required for climate change and to make ourselves resilient. But the whole idea here is how do we end up with a resilient business going forward?
Thank you very much. Are there any questions from the floor? As always, I've got a list, so I can help you all out. Any questions coming forth? Yeah, there's one here, and there's one over there as well, Charles, in a minute.
James, the mechanics of putting the carbon back underground, is that in all your arable fields on a rotational basis, or does that just go back underground in specific sites?
So our plan is to store it in specific sites, and the reason for that is so that we can measure it, and in 100 years' time, anyone which we've sold a carbon credit to knows exactly where their carbon is being stored. And so What we have looked at is the idea of putting biochar into arable fields as part of a rotation. The challenge we have is under that storage system, I can't guarantee the carbon is going to be there for the long term, whereas the patent we filed around our storage is absolutely key and is what we've been able to demonstrate, and hence DESNES have sort of come out and supported this greater than 1,000-year permanence.
Thank you. Charles, is there a question?
Did you look into potential land value changes with change of use on the land?
Yeah, and I think there's a number of elements to that. So there's the land value of continuing the status quo. If my land gets flooded more often because of climate change, if I'm unable to grow the crops that I'm currently able to grow because of these new weather events which are happening, as I say, the weather events have always happened. What the difference is the frequency and the variation. So that standard deviation has got a lot worse. It is a certain consideration that, you know, what is the value? But if you're looking at it from the income potential of that land on an annual basis compared to the the alternative, and if you then think that actually assets over time do revert to their income, yes, we've been disconnected because of subsidy schemes, but as those change, so we actually, it is certainly a real consideration, and it's a real consideration if you're trying to borrow money to do those projects.
That's great, thank you. Any more questions from the floor? In terms of AI and robotics, how well do you think they will be embraced going forwards? We've seen just recently the news of the small robot company, but certainly going forward, you know, AI and robots are sort of seen as maybe a silver bullet to look at increased productivity or decreasing inputs, potentially helping with the challenges of the labour shortage. But from your perspective, how do you see them being embraced?
Well, what's been really fascinating is the huge level of interest we've had for our equipment. So we put out even a very simple thing on LinkedIn to say we're looking for 5 pioneers to look for this through the 24th season. We came back with over 35,000 hectares worth of land from the farmers who approached us, and that was from 20 different countries around the world. So it's really interesting, that level of requirement, particularly in the fresh produce sector, which is facing very severe labour challenges and that increased cost of labour. To me, you know, what it enables you to do is to start thinking about the individual plant. There's no way that any farm manager can remember 8 million broccoli plants on our farm, which are growing in the summer. But actually, it's a very tiny amount of data for a computer to remember. And what we can do, therefore, is map those. And you can only do it with that sort of technology. So particularly as well with the new capital grants from DEFRA on farm productivity, there is a real interest in this, and I do see it as there. Is it a silver bullet? No, it never is. No technology ever solves the full problem, and it's how people adopt it. But we do see there's huge potential.
Thank you. Do we have one last question from the floor? Thank you.
Yeah, hi there. You said your robotic machines are doing about 60 plants per second now. I mean, is there any way you can quantify that in terms of hectares per hour or area? And I know you're going to develop it for the use in cereals as well.
Yeah, so in terms of quantifying that, if I said that on our organic farm last summer, we had up to 2,000 weeds per square metre, which was a real challenge. I mean, most of the time you'd be looking at a density of around sort of 25 weeds per square metre. So you'll be able to do a couple of square metres a second is where we see it. Obviously, we've been focused on those high-value crops to start simply because there isn't the alternative of chemical. We've started a project on sugar beet, for example, as our sort of way into those broadacre crops. So I do see it coming. It will obviously take longer just purely because the value of weeding in an arable crop is significantly lower.
Fantastic. Thank you very much to James. Thank you for your time and for sharing. Thank you very much. If we can show our appreciation. It feels like we've arrived here very, very quickly at our keynote speaker, but I'd like to introduce David Webster. David joined Leaf as the CEO from the UK Grocery Division of Associated British Foods, ABF, where he was Director of Sustainability and External Affairs. Leaf is among the UK's leading organisations delivering assurance and insight into climate positive and agroecological farming. For many of us, Leaf is best known for facilitating Open Farm Sunday. I'm thrilled to welcome David to the stage.
Thank you very much indeed, Kelly, and thank you everybody for welcoming me here today. And that last presentation, James, was just absolutely mind-blowing. When you see the energy and the transition that's taking place in farming currently, it is just extraordinary when you see the inventiveness of businesses such as yourselves and some of the others which have been profiled here today. I'm afraid my photograph here is a little bit old as well, and I probably need to do something about that. Let's move this on. Well, I really wanted to start by talking a little bit today about Leaf as an organisation and just reflecting briefly upon my predecessor, Caroline Drummond. I'm well aware that the only reason really I'm stood here today is because of the organisation that she built over 30 years since 1991. Caroline was just extraordinary, a force of nature, as I think most people in this room would know. The organisation, the legacy that she's left us and the organisation that she's left us is also quite extraordinary as well. So Leaf, for those of you who don't know, we obviously have the Leaf Mark Standard, which is a sort of framework of assurance, which I'll come on to in a little bit. We have the Open Farm Sunday events that we run as well, which have just been referenced, and we are looking for farmers if anybody is interested for this year's event. I know it's a lot of work, but it's a really seminal, important date in the calendar. And then we have our education and peer-to-peer learning work that we do as well. And just to give a bit of scale to that, last year the Leaf Education team took 38,000 children out onto working farms. We don't do sort of bucolic farming, we do real-world careers in the land-based sector, and we work very hard to engage young people and try to bring them into our industry and show them the reality of food and farming. So this incredible legacy that Caroline has left us. What I wanted to do today was just talk a little bit about my background and then get into the details of the macro trends as I see them in relation to food, farming, sustainability and the environment. Where is that coming from? What does it mean? And then the back end of this presentation, I've got some slides just to talk in a little bit more depth, probably more with my corporate hat on and my past life, but just reflecting upon where I see the retailers currently and what that might mean for you as farmers in the current environment. So, just as a little bit of background on me, Caroline and I actually, we first worked together in about 2009, 2010, when I was on the board of the British Nutrition Foundation with her. And then in 2011, I asked whether Leaf would work with me on the development of what we call the Jordan's Farm Partnership, which was, so at the time I was a sustainability lead at Jordan's Cereals. I think the Jordan's Farm Partnership is a pretty good example actually of stacking, as you refer to it here, of multiple different interventions on farm which cumulatively add income generation capability to farmers. So Bill Jordan, another great sort of pioneer of conservation farming in the 1980s, developed a scheme whereby he paid all of the growers within his oat supply chain a marginal premium for protecting wildlife habitat on their land. Today, the scheme consists of 34 farmers, covers an area of about 15,000 hectares. So to people outside of farming, we say that's about the size of a city of Oxford. We partner with the wildlife trusts as well, who run the biodiversity framework within that scheme. And 27% of the 15,000 hectares within that scheme are now managed for wildlife biodiversity, with the farmers within it all receiving a premium too. And Leaf is integral to that. All of the farms within that system are Leaf Mark certified. And I think just reflecting on today and being here and just listening to the debate in this forum in one of the great home counties of agriculture, I just reflect how sad I am really that Caroline is not here too, because I know she would have loved to hear this. This is the world that she hoped would emerge, it being brought to life. And I think it's an incredibly exciting time in terms of where agriculture is going to and what that might mean for farming. I'm afraid to say that for a little bit is where the fluffy side of my presentation ends, and I want to talk a little bit around what I'm referring to as tectonic plates, just for a few minutes. I used the term tectonic plates. When I was growing up, I had a great uncle who'd fought in the war, and as a 10-year-old, it was very exciting because he had a tobacco tin with machine gun bullets in which had been shot at him from a Messerschmitt in the desert, and he'd dug these things out and put them in a tin. Anyway, he referred to me on one occasion when I got a bit older. He said to me, "Look, David, you've got to understand, in life sometimes the tectonic plates move, and if you're unlucky, you get caught within the middle of it." And he served right the way through the whole of the war. He had a pretty awful experience, I suspect. But I think those tectonic plates are moving now at one hell of a pace. And what I want to do is, I don't want to create a sense of concern around that, but I would be quite keen if I could just to sort of talk about what are driving those plates, because I think it's helpful to think of them in those terms. These things are immovable. They are not things which we have a choice about whether we face into them. The question is, how do we avoid, as it says on the slide, the ring of fire, and how do we make sure that our businesses are positioned to navigate what is an increasingly challenging landscape? So I'm going to start off with the consequences, and I don't really need to say this to any of you in here. I'm painfully aware that you really got the worst of it over the last few months in terms of rain and flooding. And I had a message through from the chairman of LEAF, who many of you will know, Philip Wynne, back in November, with a picture of awfully flooded farmland, and he just said underneath it, "You do not have to convince me about climate change. This is happening, it is real." And I think as we reflect upon what's actually going on here, if you compare the UK now to pre-industrial times, the scientists are saying that we're 30 times more likely to experience heat waves in the summer. And for every 1 degree with which the air temperature warms, that air can hold 7% more moisture. So at the same time as the temperature warming in the air around us, we're also experiencing much more severe flooding, much more severe rainfall as well. The other thing which is happening globally, and I think this has already been alluded to in the presentations before, is frankly we've got less and less land to grow the food to feed a massively growing population. So if you look at this slide here, what this is showing is basically that since 1961 we have less than half the land per person in the world to feed every individual on the planet. And that is despite massive land use change, much of which is contributing to some of the problems which we're now being expected to manage. And I'll come back to this in a moment, but as we go through climate change, the reality is that there's going to be less land available, not more. And this is just a chart which I'm sure everybody in this room will have seen before, but this is showing the trends on global population growth. And Professor Jude Kappa, who I'm sure many of you will have heard speak before, has a lovely chart which shows the whole map of the world. And there's a circle around India and China and the Pacific area. There are more people living in that circle than there are on the whole of the rest of the planet. And that was a really startling point for me when I saw that being presented at the recent RASE lecture. So that's tectonic plate number one, is population growth. Tectonic plate number two clearly is climate change. And again, I don't know if anyone saw the BBC News this morning, but there's data that's out today which shows a 1.5 degree rise in global temperatures, which is a key threshold moment. The likelihood is we will officially pass through that threshold in the next decade, which is not far, as everyone in this room will know. That's not a long time at all. Now, that is significant because it's at that stage that very large parts of the world, which currently provide habitat for people are living there, there's places for food growing, they're going to come out of production. That land will come out of production and people will want to move. So we're going to experience quite a lot of change. And I also read a report from Stanford University in the States, which was saying that they'd modeled using AI what's likely to happen to temperatures even if we decarbonise rapidly, and the estimate is that even if we decarbonise now very rapidly, we're still likely to go through a 2-degree warming cycle somewhere around 2060. So that means, for me, I've got two children, they're 12 and 14, my children's generation and the generation after that are going to be dealing with this combination of very rapid population growth globally and very erratic weather patterns. I do apologise for if I'm depressing you. I'm afraid it gets a little bit worse, but then it does get better. So these are the global impacts of agriculture, and I think that, agriculture is completely stuck because on one hand, particularly since the war in this country, but globally, we've done a great job of feeding people when we need to. The problem is that, as has already been alluded to, is that the byproduct of these approaches has resulted in some pretty awful externalities in terms of the environment, and these are really coming into focus, not just in the UK. I mean, I thought the presentations this morning were superb, but the reality is globally, policymakers are looking at these challenges and saying we need to change things. And I particularly look at the eutrophication numbers there. 78% of pollution in water is caused as a direct consequence of agricultural activity. I mean, that is pretty significant. And the other significant impact, of course, of this, and particularly of land use change, is biodiversity loss. So this is a chart showing a biodiversity intactness index. And the reason I chose this particular chart is because you can see that in Europe, actually, we're turning a corner. It's starting to slow and come back. But in the rest of the world, that pattern is not happening. And massive amounts of land conversion, particularly from pristine forest lands in parts of the world into agricultural land, is causing huge problems. Okay. And then my final tectonic plates that I want to reference is government policy. And I would say this is important. There's some important points to understand here. So this chart shows total emissions into the UK. It's showing emissions in terms of consumption, both in the context of the goods that we consume, which are produced within the UK, and the goods which we're importing into the UK, which are in that, let me just get this right, embedded imported goods. The dark blue line is the embedded in the imported goods piece there. So what you can see is both of those two things. But the critical point to understand in terms of government policy on decarbonisation is that actually, by law, our focus is going to be only on decarbonising production from within the UK. So technically, from a farming perspective, we could bring down emissions from the food that we produce in the UK, import food which has got higher emissions, and actually we're still fully legally compliant with the obligations which are placed on the UK government. And I think this is an important point that we need to understand. I think DEFRA are quite sincere in saying that they want to protect food security in the UK, but they have a legal obligation to reduce, to come towards net zero. They do not have the legal obligation on the other side of that debate. And I think this is a really key consideration, because we've got to get this balance right, and my concern actually as somebody who's deeply committed to environmental farming is that if we don't get that balance right, actually we could have a surge in policy back towards a much more intensive productive system, which actually does a huge amount more harm and frankly alienates the public further from farming communities, which I do not think is desirable on any measure. Okay. Now, this is where we get a bit more positive. I have to say, it is an extraordinary period of transition, though, we are going through. And I came into this job in September. I must admit I was a little bit cynical about regenerative farming because I'd heard too many corporations talk to the point about regenerative farming, and I thought to myself, this is a great buzzword. What does it actually mean? I have to say, having spent 4 months visiting some of the most incredible farms in the UK, I am a total convert. And I think particularly things like cover cropping, you can really see the impacts. And when I've spoken to farmers like Jake Freestone, who was mentioned earlier, Duncan Farrington, these are very good farmers, I've said to them consistently, tell me why you are following these frameworks. The message comes back consistently, this helps me manage my costs. The environmental is great, and I've seen the most incredible environmental delivery, but in terms of resilience of the farm and in terms of cost management, it is extraordinary. And I think the SFI grants, where we're going to, maybe the numbers aren't quite right. I think there's going to be an awful lot of people moving over to it because, frankly, why would you not de-risk your business in the current climate by taking the very generous SFI payments which are available? I think they are moving us in the right direction where many farmers who've not previously engaged with this type of farming system will come over to it. I'm sure they will see benefits from changing their approaches. You know, the reality is that farming is really right in the center of these two challenges between, on one side, resilience and being able to secure crop outcomes and maintain and protect your yields and the efficiency of your business, versus on the other side, meeting this rapidly changing compliance environment, which is moving upon us at a great pace. And I genuinely think, actually, in that context, frameworks like LeafMark, like management systems which can help farmers think through that process, are an important tool. And if I think about engaging with agriculture and transitioning agriculture on a global scale, which is even more complicated than in the UK, I think actually management systems, data, they're probably the single most important tool and lever that we can pull to change the way the systems function at pace and scale within the timeframes that we have open to us. And I come back to this 1.5 degrees transition within the next 10 years. We do not have long to change the way we do things to be able to sustain the changing weather patterns that we are going to face. From a leaf perspective, and actually this project's already been mentioned before, so I won't overplay it. The NCS project looking at beans, this is fabulous. We're one of the partners in this. We also have now 5 farms which are going on the journey to net zero from all around the world. They're being featured on the Leaf website, and we're profiling those farmers as they go through that journey to try and shed and cascade information about their approach and their learnings along the way. And then this is not a Leaf slide. This is a slide I stole from a website, which is Gentle Farming. I don't know if Thomas Gentle's in the room. We spoke on a number of occasions when I was in ABF, but I think Thomas's website and Gentle Farming's website is really interesting because they disclose their financial data from having moved to more regenerative farming practices. And what you can see here is on their financial, they're saying that their costs are 27% less on equivalent yields from their conventional farming system. Now, the reason I'm putting this up there is because, number one, I think this is a great example of innovation, entrepreneurial farming, which needs to be celebrated, but also that message around cost reduction and maintaining yields is consistently what we're hearing from farmers within the Leaf network as well that have adopted these type of frameworks. This is about engaging with input costs and reducing them over time. And then actually, James, this is to the point that you were just making as well. This slide here is making the point that it's from the Royal Society that as well as being as land managers, farmers also are going to be able to engage with other new novel technologies, which will be such as biochar, for helping us fundamentally take carbon out of the atmosphere. And I think increasingly that will become a more normalized approach to farming over the decades ahead. Okay. So if that's the direction of travel farming, this engaging between regenerative practices, new novel technologies to decarbonize, as we've all seen today, I just wanted to sort of take a few slides to just talk to you about the perspective, the understanding what I would perceive as being the retailer perspective. So I'm not a retailer, I'm not from that background, but I think I've got a pretty clear sense of how those businesses are responding. And then what I wanted to do was just show you a few slides about what I think that might mean to you as farmers as you start to engage with the retailers. So the first thing I wanted to say is that, the retailers, we tend to think of them as through the lens of the buyer. But actually, that's only one very narrow aspect of how retailers interact with the farming sector and how they think about their supply chains. And this is a model I pulled together actually originally when I was in my corporate role to try and talk to my colleagues about the need to think more broadly about how we engage with retail frameworks. And what it's showing is basically that actually retailers have got a number of significant challenges that they're managing simultaneously. And there are 4 forces really acting upon their business. And those forces are, on the one hand, of course, they're about supply chain. Can I get the products I need to be able to sell? I mean, last year I went into Asda near where I lived and there were no carrots on the shelf. And a supermarket with carrots is not a terribly good supermarket. You need supply, okay? So secondly is financial. And the financial, obviously, is the buyer relationship. Are we buying at the right price to sustain our business? That's no different to any other business. So I know buyers get a very hard time, but the simple reality is if you're commercially minded, you think about what you pay for the inputs you put in. The third area is around shopper demand and marketing, and the fourth area is around license to operate. So license to operate could span two different things. It could span your legal obligations on the organisation, or it could span the factors which shape what will become those laws. So, for example, at the moment, most of the UK retailers are engaging with the WWF on their shopping basket metric, which includes requirements to commit to sustainable farming frameworks. Now, the reason I put this up here is because in the centre of all of this, of course, will be the board of directors who are managing and leading that organisation. And they are weighing up all of these different factors simultaneously on a day-by-day basis. And if you go to the extremes of the square and you talk to, for example, the buyer who is only focused on financial matters, of course, all they will want to talk to you about is the price of the goods that they're selling. If you went to the lawyer, they'd talk to you about the contract. If you went to the shopper, they'd talk to you about what if you went to the shoppers section, you'd be talking to a marketeer. But as people become more senior within their roles and they converge around that sort of central circle within the board of directors, there are much more nuanced conversations taking place right now. And I'm going to give a flavour of what some of those are, because I think they actually do point to where there are quite significant opportunities potentially for farmers and producers that can think in a slightly more flexible way around the nature of the relationship they want to have. The first one I've pulled out is around marketing and marketing positioning, and these are all projects where we're working with retailers on signalling messages about how that retailer is perceived to their shopper base. So we've got Marks and Spencer's with their Farming with Nature program, which is very similar to the Jordan's Farm Partnership model. It's a framework which is based around farmers being paid for putting a certain percentage of their land into habitats, which then links into their business model. Waitrose, who that's the Leckford estate, who are doing a lot of work and a lot of thinking around regen at the moment. Themselves. They were also one of the first, they were the first supermarket to take leaf into its global supply chain operations. And then Tesco, who are working with us to take leaf mark across its entire global supply chain operations. So this is really about two things. This is about signaling to the public that they care about some of these issues and are trying to engage with the concerns of the general public around sustainability, but also signalling and working with NGOs and other civil society actors who have a very keen interest in exactly what these organisations are doing. That pressure, the pressure from civil society, is escalating at one heck of a pace. And these are I've put down here some examples of things where retailers, large businesses of all sorts, are having to provide more and more information to organisations in order to substantiate the approach that they're taking to working with farm businesses like yourselves and the work that you are doing in terms of your farm supply chain operations. So for some of you, if you're not maybe familiar with these, there's the Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosure, which requires an assessment of climate risk within the overarching business operation. Task Force on the Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, which again is a disclosure which is now being made to the city to say where are you having an impact on the natural world around you. There's legislation increasingly on deforestation. And retailers are balancing all of this suite of pressures onto their operations. And just to illustrate this further, this chart is showing enacted legislation since 2010 to 2012 globally linked to ESG factors. So this is the sea change in legislation that all corporations in the UK are having to face into. So if we go back to 2014, 2015, there was the UK Modern Slavery Act, and I'm sure many businesses in this room will have interacted that particularly through gangmaster licensing, etc. If you look at more recently, 2022, the EU Corporate Sustainability Directive, which is currently coming through now, will require something in the region of 1,226 non-financial disclosure points, which will be these retailers like Tesco will be audited against in future and potentially by the likes of Ernst & Young PwC. It's a very, very different world. You've got to have evidence to show the impact that your organisation is having upon the supply chain. And clearly that is changing the nature of the conversations they're having with organisations like Leaf and how they're thinking about engagement in that context. Just to illustrate what this looks in practice, these are the requirements for TCFD, Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. You've got to have a governance framework which is led by the board. There's a requirement there for a very clear risk management framework, looking in detail at the scope of the risks on the corporation, and then strategies to mitigate that risk and point towards opportunities. And more importantly, from the perspective of the audience today, we also need indicators and targets, and I'm going to come on to that in a little bit more detail now. So we've already talked about Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions today. So Scope 1, just as a reminder, is inside the organisation. This would be Tesco's own operations or Waitrose' own operations. Scope 2 is the energy required to fuel that operation. So where are you getting your energy from? Is that coming from renewable sources, etc.? Scope 3 is the nightmare. It's really, really complicated. And there are some really very, very significant tensions in this data streams flowing into the requirements of very large corporations versus individual farming businesses, such as many of you sat here today. The tension fundamentally is between the aggregated data, the need for aggregated data sets, and individual farm-based data sets. Now, many in the city would like those two numbers to match. And there's a pressure to bring down to say these two things have got to be exactly the same number. Now, in reality, that is very, very hard to deliver. The average supermarket stocks something in the region of 30,000 stocking units in a large supermarket. Now, if you think about all the ingredients that are in every one of those products, where they've come from, measuring it, analysing it, getting it down to a level of absolute clarity on detail, it's simply not possible to do. Conversely, from the perspective of many of you in this room, you will be thinking about where is the opportunity on your markets, selling biodiversity credits, selling carbon credits. Now, both of these things present challenges, I would suggest, at the moment. I think these market systems here are still very formative. We had our conference last week, the LEAF conference, and Professor Jacqueline McGlade spoke, who is the former UN chief climate scientist, and she made the point that they'd assessed one farm using 6 different verified methodologies for carbon assessment. On that one farm, there was a 15% variance in the measured carbon on that land. So until we get to clarity on some of these, how are we going to measure this, I think there's still a lot of forming that needs to go on there. Strutton Parker also spoke, and they made the point that the biodiversity net gain credit market may not be as big as originally thought, because developers are getting very good at offsetting biodiversity within the context of the developments they're putting forwards. Whether that actually turns into habitat for the long term, I think, waits to be seen, but they are certainly mitigating the need to pay into the funds, which would ultimately go into the credit market. Either or, we've got this tension for the supermarkets between the need for aggregated data versus the need of your farm for bespoke data. And that tension matters, and it matters on two fronts, because it means that the retailers are going to have to move more and more to using emissions factor data. And what I mean by emissions factor data is where you don't know the precise emissions of your individual product, you use a recognized number as a proxy for that volume. So I buy X thousand tons of beef, and then I put a number against it, which is based upon a recognized stamp-approved methodology. Now, the question is, what is that number and where has it come from? And this chart here is from a website called Our World in Data. It shows the detail of it doesn't particularly matter at this stage. That just you need to know that the SIN number at the top is beef. So this is showing the carbon impact of beef, and in an aggregate sense. Well, where has that number come from, I would suggest, is a question which needs to be at the forefront of your minds. So that shows beef is pretty awful. So if you took that number at the previous number on its own, you would say beef is pretty awful. When you drill down one bit further, you say, well, this is from the BBC, and it's showing, actually, beef can have a massive impact in terms of its emissions, but it can also be not that bad. So, okay, so there's a big spectrum here, which I think people in this room are probably aware of. And if you go down one step further, let's look at the highest emissions for beef. Where is that coming from? So this is a chart which shows actually the highest emitting beef by global region is actually coming out of Africa. And European beef is 60% less than that, significantly lower. So already we're lower. And if we drill into that African line, the red line at the very top here, what's driving this? So this chart here shows, this is from the same presentation data, FAO data. It's showing that for the large part, the single biggest factor driving the emissions on that number on that beef at the top is not the farming system, It is the fact that the land in which the beef is grazing was previously forest. It's land use change. So this is really, really important for you, I would suggest. Because the question is, what number ultimately ends up on the pack? And I think right now we've got a food data transparency partnership program running through the Institute of Grocery Distribution. They're doing a lot of work on potentially labelling to consumers. And if you are beef farmers, if we are in UK agriculture, we have to work together to ensure that there's an accurate data set which sits against the numbers which are going to go in front of the public to indicate the environmental impact of the important work that you do. Now, coming back to this model then, just briefly to reflect upon these four forces. If we took financial out, I just assume that financial tensions are always going to be there in the relationship with any retailer. There are a number of things which I think we can be doing to engage with retailers in a slightly different way, both in terms of improving the security of the supply chain, creating narrative stories about where how brands are adding value, how your farm is adding value, and then also helping to gather data in the right way that works for your business and the retailer to enable them to report accurately, and also, more importantly, for you to benefit from the security of the supply that comes from being able to give them that data. So my conclusions are, number one, it's very, very clear from just being here today that tectonic plates are moving. And in a really positive way, I have to say, I mean, and again, I come back to it, Caroline would have loved this, the direction of travel. Things in many ways are very, very good. But engagement with sustainability is not an option. And I think if I went back 10 years ago, it would have felt very optional. Even 3-4 years ago, I think for some farmers, there's a sense of we're here to just grow wheat or whatever the crops are. The environmental things are actually a secondary consideration. I think that those days really are moving away very rapidly. The questions really are, how do you position your business? And how, I mean, obviously, how can organisations like Leaf help you position your businesses? And the message I'd like to leave you with is, I do think the numbers matter. They matter for your business. They matter for the sectors in which you operate in. The narrative and the story you can tell around how you produce your food matters. And I think that is pretty key, because fundamentally farming matters and what you do matters. And before I leave today, I would just like to play, if I may, a short film to bring the Jordan's Farm Partnership to life, which I think illustrates some of these points. This particular film means a great deal to me because it was the very last project that Caroline and I worked upon together back in 2022, and she features in this. This was taken about 3 months before she passed away.
I'm the fourth generation on this farm. When I was in my early teens, the hedges were cut very short. Every ditch was dug out, but that's actually very valuable habitat.
The idea that healthy food needs to be grown in a healthy environment has been part of the Jordan's DNA from the very start. And for decades, we've been working with our farmers to create wildlife, rich and friendly habitats. The Jordan's Farm Partnership is a pioneering collaboration between ourselves, the Wildlife Trust, Leaf, and the Prince's Countryside Fund to focus on sustainability across our entire UK farm supply chain. It is a holistic approach to sustainability across the partners, and it's one that we're really proud of.
So we've cultivated up this plot here specifically to help the woodlarks breed.
I've had 3 males singing this morning. That's really good news. Habitat management is challenging. The farmer needs to actually provide those habitats. They're sown habitats. Pollen and nectar plots, wild bird food plots, hedgerows. They need to be looked after with as much care, really, as the crops.
We've got this plot where we're trying to provide as much food as we can for pollinators, all the bugs.
See the clovers and things?
That'll be up to here.
Yeah.
I had always felt that if nature is doing well around us, then we're probably doing something right for the crops we're growing. There's no reason that we can't have conservation going on right next to efficient food production.
The Leaf Mark provides a management framework to achieve a high standard of soil health, decarbonisation, water quality, whilst also boosting productivity and benefiting the environment.
If we want to accelerate change and really turbocharge the change that now is needed for climate change mitigation, for really building biodiversity and biological diversity, it's about nature-based solutions and how we are smart in using nature to help build resilience in the field.
But it's a long-term commitment.
I'm fortunate in that what I do, I absolutely love. So this time of year is actually a good time to see tadpoles. That's always a good sign of a nice, healthy pond. I have worked with the Prince's Countryside Fund, mentoring some students. Farming has huge, huge challenges. The important thing is to educate the next generation so that there is more awareness of habitat and sustainability. I love seeing the seasons. I love seeing the farm grow and looking for ways that we can improve the environment that we're in, the business we want to drive forward.
Thank you very much.
We're going to have time for just one question. So is there a burning question from the floor that you would like to ask David? I know, David, you're keen for discussion, conversation, any thoughts. As you'd expect, I have a list, so I can go to my list. Okay, you mentioned about policy and the legal obligation that we have to reach net zero, not necessarily a policy on food production, and therefore we could import food to meet our demands. And it's a rather large question, and I'm going to apologise for it now, but what would your suggestion be to government for an integrated approach?
Gosh, that's a really difficult question. I mean, I think fundamentally, we are moving in the right direction, from my perspective, in terms of embracing sustainable farming and putting frameworks in place which are going to move us towards more sustainable farming models. I think if I balance the perspective that I've got now as the Chief Executive of Leaf, but with my previous role within Associated British Foods, I think the critical point is about ensuring a really clear alignment between the environmental objectives linked to farming and the productivity agenda as linked to the food production sector, and how do we bring those two things together. At the moment, I think it's a bit of an either or. The big danger here is if volumes of food start to fall away and it makes the secondary processing sector non-viable in key areas, and that starts to drop out because it's no longer commercially sustainable to keep some of these businesses operating in the UK, it will not come back. And I think the NFU are absolutely right to say it won't come back because simply the margins are not there. So we have to link those two things together more effectively. I think that would be my answer.
Fantastic. Can we thank David in the usual way, please? Well, I said it before, I couldn't believe we're actually at the keynote speaker time, and I can't believe we're at the end of the conference. So the 8th Lincolnshire Farming Conference is coming to a close, and what a conference it has been. Thank you again to all of our speakers. Thank you very much for your time to be here. We're hugely grateful to you and for the time that you give. This is a challenging time as we navigate through the programmes and the opportunities that are available to us. Fundamentally, though, we know that the environment underpins sustainable agriculture, and we need to integrate its protection and its recovery with food production and business profitability. Our aim is that you've all attended today and that you go away having learnt something, and I really do hope that that is the case. A huge thank you to the Lincolnshire Agricultural Society, the Lincolnshire Showground, the LFC Steering Group, the exhibitors, and to all of our sponsors who make today happen. Thank you very much. To Streets, to Omex Agriculture, to Shakespeare Martineau, to Waldmarsh, Brown & Co., J.H. Walter, Anglian Water, University of Lincoln, Class, and to Dallas Scott as well. It's an absolute privilege and honour for me to have stood here today as chair of this conference, and I thank you all for all of your support. We wish you a safe onward journey, and we look forward to seeing you in 2025. Thank you very much.